Well, welcome to our program today, the first of 2022. On behalf of the USC Center on Public Diplomacy, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that this year provides you with excellent health and creativity as we navigate our new normal, whatever that's going to look like over the next few weeks, few months, the next year. My name is Stacy Ingber. I am the Associate Director of Programming and Operations here at the USC Center on Public Diplomacy. And today we will have a fascinating conversation. So just to let you know, you could submit your questions through the questions tab on the GoToWebinar interface. We'll share those with our moderator. We will have introductory remarks, and then our speaker, Dr. Corneliu Bjola, will have his remarks. Then we'll get into the conversation and answer your questions. And just an aside, we have our next program on January 25th with our beloved friend and scholar, Philip Sieb, and I hope that you RSVP for that. So without further ado, let's jump into the program. I'd like to introduce Dr. Aimee Wang, who's a professor at USC Annenberg here with us at CPD. She earned her PhD in communication at the University of Oklahoma, a beautiful campus if you have not visited. And she has a background in strategic PR, social network approach, and we could think of nobody better to have a conversation with Corneliu about the disruptions coming down the pike, both for public diplomacy and network theory and PR. She is a prolific scholar. She is published. She's on editorial boards. I'll put her bio in the chat so you can see more about her. So without further ado, I would like to both thank and welcome Dr. Aimee Yang for joining us, and she'll kick off our program. Have a great time.
Thank you so much, Stacy. So good morning, everybody. My name is Aimee. So today it's my pleasure to be here to moderate this session. So I would like to introduce Professor Corneliu Bjola, who is an associate professor in diplomatic studies at the University of Oxford. And he's also the head of the Oxford Digital Diplomacy Research Group. Professor Bjola, his research is fascinating. In recent days, in preparation for this webinar, I've been reading his articles and I was deeply impressed. So now, without further ado, I would like to turn this over to Professor Bjola. I'm sure he's going to bring wonderful thoughts and ideas to this panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thank you very much, Center for Public Diplomacy at USC for inviting me to have this conversation. So my plan today, because I have about 20 minutes, just to introduce, my thoughts. My plan today is to look a little bit at what I call now public diplomacy 3.0. It's a vision of what we expect, to happen in the future. And the reason I want to talk about this today is that because I think there is a sense that nowadays that digital public diplomacy, public diplomacy 2.0, if we want to use this way of labeling, has been stagnating. There is a sense of fatigue and even disappointment or disillusionment with the way in which social media operates. For this reason, I thought that might be interesting, to look beyond social media and try to see what is on the horizon, what kind of new digital platforms or digital technologies might be relevant in the years ahead to be used in public diplomacy. So I'm going to focus on 4 different types of trends, let's say mini trends. They are developing, they are evolving, they are not consolidated at the moment. But I'm going to say something about micro communities. I'm going to say something about the role of games in public diplomacy. I'm going to say a few words about what is now the buzzword around Facebook, Metaverse. And I'm going to conclude with some remarks about NFTs, non-fungible tokens. These are the, in the 20 minutes that I have, the type of thing that I think might be interesting to look at. But let me start with the beginning. And the beginning is, as I said, there is a sense of fatigue with social media. Why is that? I mean, if we look at the metrics, what we see nowadays that there is a sense that social media has peaked, right? comparing, for instance, to 2012, the time that we spent on average daily on social media. So in 2012, it was about 90 minutes, 1 hour and a half. By 2018, it increased to 142 minutes, 2018. And guess what? Last year, it was exactly the same. So 4 years in a row, the time we spent on social media has stayed the same. There is no growth. Moreover, 50% of, according to other statistics, 50% of users on social media, comparing with last year, they say that they use social media less this year comparing with last year. There is also a change of behavior. People are posting less. So 50% drop in posting on Facebook, for instance, comparing with 18 months ago. And people are using it, me including, I'm using social media more for information than posting, than sharing. And why is that? I mean, we know a little bit why. I mean, we clearly, because there is a perception that social media doesn't deliver anymore. Because, the dark side sort of has taken over. Social media has become, there's the perception that social media has become a little bit quite antisocial. It's the question of privacy, the question of disinformation, of emotional abuse with the trolling. So these are the concerns that sort of convince the people, to stay a little bit or to move away from social media. There is one trend, there is one platform bucking the trend, and this is TikTok. TikTok has been the most popular website in 2021. It's expected to reach about 1.5 billion users next year, which is more than Instagram. Instagram reached about 1 billion users in 2018 and stayed the same. So TikTok is the only platform that sort of, goes against the trend. And maybe we can talk about that later. So what's the solution then? So in a sense, social media is stagnating. It's the stand that, things are not moving in the right direction. For Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the market is also roughly saturated. 97% of the UN member states have opened a social media account, a Facebook account by 2018. 81% are on Instagram. So it reached a little bit, the point of saturation also for Ministry of Foreign Affairs. What can be done, and they've seen a little bit of that, is to use more sophisticated tools to become more effective in the way in which you perform or you do your public diplomacy campaign. Artificial intelligence, for instance, is one new interesting approach to this. Why is that? Because you can train your develop machine learning models to see what kind of programs what kind of campaigns could become more effective, to identify patterns of success. That's one direction. Or you can use AI to understand, given a particular limited budget, which type of public campaign could become more effective given the target audience. So there is a little bit of that in the sense that AI could break through, help break through this stagnation point. But also that very much depends on the type of resources that you have. So where is growth? Where is growth at the moment? What are people interested in? What kind of platforms? So the first trend that we observe nowadays is a retreat from sharing with a lot of people, right, with collectivities. It's a retreat from sharing with everyone to sharing in trusted circles. So this is why I'm talking about micro communities, the rise of micro communities. We go back to micro communities. And why so? I mean, partly is because of this perception of social media that is not working well. So micro communities, where do you find them? You find them on messaging applications. WhatsApp has been around, used by diplomats for especially coordinating positions, the UN and other environments. Hasn't been used much for public diplomacy, but where I think, what platform I think it's particularly useful for public, it's not WhatsApp, it's Telegram. I've been doing a little bit of research on that. And Telegram has grown quite significantly in the past year, has about 500 million users. And the advantage for public is that it has channels that you can have unlimited subscribers. We see, for instance, quite a number of organizations, governments have moved and opened channels. Israel MFA has about 6,000 subscribers on its channel. Israel Defense Forces, Indian Defense Forces has about 150,000 subscribers on its Telegram channel. Singapore, Somalia has its own PD channel, public diplomacy channel as well. So there is a little bit of movement into that direction, and Telegram seems to position itself as an interesting tool for developing these micro communities in which public diplomacy could be used to be used for public diplomacy. The second trend that I like to highlight is switching from sharing to performing, not only to engage in storytelling, but also in story acting. And here, the role of games comes to the fore. Why so? There is a perception, including the State Department, that games are now the place to be. In the same way that social media, after the Arab Spring, became, relevant. This is where the audience were, right? After the Arab Spring, social media was the big trend. Nowadays, there's the perception that games are playing the same role. This is where audiences are. There are 3 billion worldwide users of games. Massive growth in the Asia Pacific region. And what is interesting about these games that governments started to pay attention to them as well. In 2017, the Bolivian government had filed a complaint with the French embassy because a French company portrayed Bolivia in a very negative light. So the point is that games shape perceptions, and this is why governments started to get involved into this. I mentioned State Department last year. Because of this perception, they started a project with the students in Israel, in UAE, in Bahrain, to do this virtual student exchange program to develop games. So there is traction in this area. There is also a little bit of the dark side on games. A number of governments I've been looking at, including Iran, including Pakistan, North Korea, China, are developing games. One of the most popular games at the moment, it's one called the Commander of the Resistance, the Amarli Battle, which was developed by the Center for Digital Products of the Iranian government, and tells the story of the late Qasem Soleimani, who was killed in a drone attack a few years ago. And it's a very heroic, nationalistic type of thing. But bear in mind, this is not only for domestic audiences. This covers, a lot of ground in the region. China has been developing a similar type of game, in which it tries to portray a battle with Japan and so on. So you see governments, in a sense, getting a little bit, but on the dark side. So games are, in a sense, the new interesting platform that we need to pay attention to. And not only because of performance, but also because in addition to games, you have apps that create what I said before, micro communities. I'm mentioning Twitch and I'm mentioning Discord. These are two platforms that allows you to have conversation while playing a game. I haven't noticed any governments using, or Ministry of Foreign Affairs or embassy using that at the moment, but I think there is potential to connect the two, what I said before, the gaming part and the micro community element, which I think it's an interesting aspect. The third trend is expanding from 2D, which is text and visuals, to 3D, which is about virtual worlds and the metaverse. Facebook has made the strategic choice to deploy, to move firmly into the direction of virtual worlds. Microsoft is doing the same. I've probably seen the news this week, its acquisition of a new gaming company. But it's not only that. One country that I think it's important to pay attention in the context of the metaverse, it's South Korea. So it's emerging as a key player in this new trend of metaverses. Keep in mind, South Korea, the largest cultural export of South Korea are games. And they have a lot of infrastructure. They have, the public. They want to create a national metaverse. A first step, for instance, has taken by the capital, Seoul, who has become the first major city to enter the metaverse. They want to create a virtual Seoul that will include everything in terms of municipal administration. So the potential for public diplomacy in the metaverse is tremendous. It also, there are certain obstacles because you still have technology to use that but I think here we're going to see a bit more. Barbados was one to make the news because the embassy of Barbados in UAE, I think, it's opened its first embassy in the Metaverse as well. So there is something here to keep in mind as well as a new trend. The role of virtual worlds are coming back, and part of it is, I mean, I think in terms of public diplomacy, the potential is tremendous. And finally, let me say a few words about non-fungible tokens. I mean, this is the buzzword of 2021, simply because it exploded. I mean, in terms of the trading volume, it reached a staggering 10 billion value, 700%, increase comparing with the previous. So you may say, well, non-fungible tokens, these are digital assets, could be, art, collectibles, whatever. It started to grow online. And you may wonder, what's the connection here with public diplomacy? Well, there is an interesting connection because these tokens can be used much more, can be used for a variety of reasons. They are exploring now. Just to give an example, for instance, San Marino, a small country in Europe, has approved the use of NFTs to issue digital COVID certificates last year. Why would they do that? For two reasons. One, because these NFTs are very difficult to falsify because it comes with the blockchain technology. So in a sense, it eliminated the problem of having fake certificates. But there was another public diplomacy reason why San Marino wanted to do this, because San Marino is positioning itself as the global blockchain technology hub in Europe. So they wanted to use NFTs in this context to portray themselves, in this light, to highlight certain elements that they think they might be relevant for them as well. So these are some of the trends that I think might be interesting to keep an eye on in the coming years. As I said, I mean, we've seen, in the case of digital adoption by governments and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it doesn't mean that all of these trends, will catch on. There are various factors that drive adoption that we've seen in the past. Why a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, adopted social media, adopted because it was this is where the audience were. This is because it was relatively cheap. It didn't require a lot of resources to create this kind of digital units. And also because, very importantly, it helped them with their work. It didn't threaten traditional ways of doing diplomatic or public diplomacy. It complemented them. So I think from using this kind of criteria, we have also to keep in mind, may want to use them to what extent they might, some of these trends that I mentioned, might be used for others. So public diplomacy 3.0, what I just to wrap up what I said, public diplomacy 0 doesn't mean that the social media is going to be eliminated. I'm just saying that in addition to social media, right? In addition to social media, I think the public diplomacy is going to be much more diverse. We're going to see an emphasis on micro communities. I think it makes sense in the context of this dark side of social media that we've seen recently. We're going to pay more attention, I think, to games. This is where the audience massively are. And I think there is a battle now, for shaping perceptions, and the first come, advantage, may play a role here as well. And of course, the role of the metaverse, which comes with a little bit of cost, startup cost, to introduce and to create. But I think it also, can play a big role as we move forward and technological costs, go down. And finally, NFTs that combine new technology. We've been talking about blockchain and public diplomacy. Here's the connection, in a sense, how the NFTs actually can bring. And I think there is more opportunity for NFTs. I mean, this is something quite new. I've been exploring it myself, trying to get my head around it. And there are some interesting features that I think have relevance, the NFTs also for public diplomacy. Giving in mind that all Ministry of Foreign Affairs have so many, especially in the cultural area, cultural diplomacy area, how many things to present and to improve their image, using them to improve their image. So I think, Amy, I'm going to stop here and invite you back to have a joint conversation.
Thank you, Professor Bjola. That was really great remarks. I do have some questions for you. So I would like to kick off the conversation with my questions. Then if we have more questions from the audience, I will be more than happy to read those and ask those questions as well. So I want to start off with a burning question from reading your articles. In one of your articles, you talked about diplomacy as a method of change management. I think that thought is really profound because it really kind of like changed our perspective about what diplomacy can do. So right now we are living through this great change. I think one maybe in like hundreds of years, this great pandemic. I think it really challenged nation states in so many profound ways. So in one of my recent conversation with a colleague who is also a public diplomacy scholar in China, she was really kind of like puzzled by how could the Chinese government respond to the changes brought about by COVID in terms of public diplomacy. Specifically, she and her colleagues in China are studying how do the government or should the government respond to misinformation about the connection between COVID and China. For example, there's a lot of misinformation about how this virus is man-made, and there was some kind of national labs involved in making this virus, and there's some sort of intentional mishandling involved in the process. So they were wondering, can they use social media or some other type of methods to respond to this? What would be the cost or opportunity involved in responding or not responding? And what do you think the type of correct or wise response should be?
Thank you very much, Amy, for the question. I mean, very important aspect here. When we talk about digital transformation, we have to be exactly what you said at the beginning. Aware of the fact that a major feature of this transformation is the speed with which it takes place. So thinking about time management here becomes quite challenging. Things happen fast. Diplomacy in the past, traditional diplomacy, had some time to adjust, right? To understand trends, to understand transformations of power, to understand, to conduct negotiations. With the digital, things happen fast. Perceptions can be destroyed overnight, or reputation can be destroyed overnight. So that's a challenge for many, and they're trying to understand how to react to this. I think this is a role to a certain extent, for developing capacity. When you mentioned the case of the COVID disinformation, I mean, that was something, I published a little bit on that. That was something that has taken many governments by surprise at the beginning of the pandemic. There were kind of stories that you wouldn't believe they will actually get any traction, but actually they did, and then they exploded. I have to say that, we have to separate periods of crisis, political crisis or global crisis from, let's say, normal times, because during political crisis, this kind of behavior is not unusual. Been studies showing that in terms of political crisis or economic crisis, disinformation it's skyrocketing. The fact that you have now social media that amplifies. So what does it mean for many? Is to develop capacity to not only to monitor but also to understand, how these stories, unfold. So, for instance, with COVID, disinformation, some of the stories, got very strong traction, and then, people started to react and try to neutralize or to eliminate some of them. It's still not working well. We see, it's still, the stories, the negative stories are still, but I think it tells something about being more proactive, developing capacity to be more proactive. I think that's something that probably we'll see nowadays, more accurately with artificial intelligence, for instance, trying to monitor the informational space. There are some interesting trends, which I'm not sure that they are very good. there is a tendency to split the internet, right? To create this what is called now digital sovereignty, and the idea being that since you are unable to control effectively the spread of stories, then you have to create borders, digital borders. And it's not something that applies only to China. China has introduced this model some time ago, but there are more voices in Europe, there are more voices in other places that we have to protect our information space because the information space is under attack through disinformation or state-sponsored disinformation. So I think there's something else happening, which I don't think is going in the right direction. But it tells you about, the inability of many governments to deal with this kind of growing problem. This is why I suggested that the other platform that I mentioned, may be able to let you to tell your own story, not only to react to what is happening. As social media has become a very problematic space simply because you are unable to tell your own story anymore. Every time when you try to do this, it is getting distracted, it's getting attacked. So that's the part of the frustration for many. How to still engage in positive contacts, in positive bridge building, in positive the traditional elements of public diplomacy, without all the time being harassed and forced to address stories that are not relevant. So that's a bigger challenge. It's clearly not easy. I think also in terms of time management, we have to draw on more expertise. Public diplomacy has been pretty good, especially in the sense that it attracted people from the journalist area because they knew how to communicate. I think we have to expand the circle and to understand, more. I mean, there is a need for psychology here. Sweden has already established a particular unit that tries to produce, psychological resilience in a sense. So there is a little bit of movement into that. So understanding and managing change, one thing that I would say it's about being more proactive, but also expanding the circle of expertise, especially when we deal with digital platforms and adapting to these new conditions.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So I have one more question. As you know, like in the process of countries engaging with the audience via digital diplomacy, either use social media or use game or any other type of tools, there's inevitably the process of data collection. And that comes back to my own research, which is to study big data, trends about big data, and also the implications of such practice. And one thing in particular that kind of like come up a lot in my own research is the boundary between legitimate communication campaigns and the invasion of privacy and even manipulation of people's reactions. So what do you think would be the boundary in terms of public diplomacy between data collection and data analysis and using such data to guide your future practice, whereas you may cross a boundary, get into foreign interference? I think some bad example would be some recent studies find out, for instance, some Russian agencies, they've been collecting user information and they've been using such information to manipulate public opinion and manipulate user responses on social media and on other type of media as well. Do you think this can be a very worrisome trend? Do you see other countries do similar things? And how can we do more ethical sort of practice of public diplomacy using digital media?
The question of data, absolutely. It's a very thorny issue. How data is collected, how data is stored, and how data is processed. These are the three elements of data management. And I think what I found interesting nowadays, especially started, for some time, governments are introducing regulations. In Europe, you have GDPR. In California, you have a similar type of Data Privacy Act. And why are these acts important? Because it says that in order to be able to conduct this type of research, you have to follow the rules. Now, imagine that, Amy, you want to do research in Europe. Then it means, you collect data on European nationals, and then you want to transfer them back to LA. That's a problem. Why is that a problem? You can, as long as you respect the GDPR in Europe, that's not a problem. But the problem is the transfer, because at the moment there is no agreement between the United States and EU about, whether to allow you to transfer this data. There've been two agreements, but both of them have been struck down by the European Court of Justice. So what I'm saying with this is that now an interesting new element has come into the traditional diplomacy part, the negotiation of data agreements. So EU, for instance, has concluded about 7 data equivalency agreements with Canada, with Australia, with Japan, and a few other countries. And the point was that exactly what you say, to have a safe space in which you want to do research. If you don't have it, then you cannot do this in principle. So that's an interesting trend that we see, the creation of safe spaces. And equivalencies between countries, and they are negotiated as we speak. Otherwise, you also speak about, you mentioned, the case of clandestine operations, right? That you have, state governments or, units affiliated with state governments, like the St. Petersburg unit, that actually does this kind of collection of data in a more surreptitious way. I think the question here is also, since we are more aware of what is happening, this is where the role of education, of resilience, being aware of what happens with the data that you use, right? I will add one more, and I think this is a new trend. I haven't mentioned that at the beginning, the Web 3.0 element. The Web 3.0 element goes exactly in this direction, because they say, well, at the moment it's just a concept. We don't know whether it's going to come into being, but the Web 3.0 tries to address exactly your concern, in which the users, the citizens, actually have a say on how their data is being used. What kind of form Web 3.0 is going to take is not very clear yet, because I fear again some sort of balkanization of the internet. But the trust, the attraction is exactly that, to be able not to allow, big tech companies to make a lot of money from your data, or, your data to be used nefariously by state-sponsored agents to manipulate you, but to have more control over the type of things that you do. Remains to be seen, but Web 3.0, it's another thing, I think, for 2022 that we need to pay attention for these reasons that you mentioned, how data is used in addition to the other elements that I highlighted.
Great, thank you so much. We do have a lot of questions from the audience as well. So I'm going to start to ask questions from the audience. So the first question asks, from practicing diplomacy, given the somewhat frustrating results of virtual embarrassings in the recent past, how do you envision Metaverse could be any different in current circumstances? Do you think that COVID has trained audience to be virtually more? That ended right here. So.
The Metaverse, of course, this is a new big word, and Facebook strategically, why people are taking this seriously this time, because we have, the Second Life, a few decades ago, but why are they taking this seriously? Because of Facebook and also Microsoft. They are investing heavily in it, and they are trying to bring the cost of goggles, down as well. So I've been playing a little bit, with the new concept of Metaverse. So the potential for negative, for things going badly is there. Why is that? On Facebook or on Twitter, it's you posting some, and then you have some information, the type of things that you write can be collected, and people can get a sense of the type of political preferences, this infometric that we mentioned in the past. But on Metaverse, it's even more immersive, because it collects a lot of information about you, not only about what you say, but also how you feel, how you move your eyes, right? In the terms of it's a entire new set of biosensors that it can collect about you. How that problem is going to be solved is not very clear, because in a sense you don't want to give access to Twitter and Facebook to the type of data that you share. Imagine that you don't want to share too much information about your biosensors once you are in. So that's another key element that has to be discussed. Speaking about time management or the time management, how to manage this kind of change by government. Governments with their regulations always lag behind, big tech, and there is by the time they catch up, they already moved on. So there is potential in terms of collecting a lot of very sensitive biodata about you in the multiverse. In terms of some of the problems that we see online, they started to create some safe spaces in which if you are harassed, you can immediately turn off and then you move in a different. So there is a little bit of that. So I think we'll have to see how things are moving. But as I mentioned, with the multiverse, I think there is more opportunity for people to know about you. If you do it, it's at the moment, you have cultural events. These are more neutral. You want to see a show. I mean, during the pandemic, that was something that was particularly important. Museums, all kind of things that you can do at the moment online. You can do it, virtually. And technology is advancing. Facebook is working on some interesting new goggles that actually combines virtual with physical reality. Right, so the desk I have here, it will be exist also in my virtual reality. So I think there is attraction for certain type of activities to move there, but be aware of the dark side. And the dark side is always about your data. What kind of data is being collected about you? How is it collected? And I think there is something to start with in terms of differentiating where you want to go. As we now do it with other platforms, right? Which platforms provide you better protection? And I think that would be probably something to keep in mind, once you move into the metaverse. But the participant is right. Potential for things going badly, it's there.
Great, thank you. So another question asks, what is the best research tool to analyze pages related to public diplomacy field on social media platforms?
On social media, there are a variety of tools that you can use, depending. Most of them, deal with Twitter, simply because it's more accessible. So for Twitter, you have a range of tools. For instance, Brand24 is one, Brandwatch others, Follower Wonk, social media with quite a number of them. Facebook is a bit more complicated because after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, they closed the door. They don't allow people to extract data directly. So what happens, especially if you are academic, you have to get in touch with Facebook, and they created a space in which you can actually access data as a scholar, as an academic, and do research. But you have to reach out to them and to make an application of some sort, so that you can apply. There are a few other tools that they try to extract some data, but not a lot of data. Facebook has closed the door for that. I think what is I think this is problematic. In a sense, it's very. I understand the reason why Facebook, after Cambridge Analytica, tried to do this, to prevent this kind of manipulation and so on. But at the same time, it closes the door to accountability. It's very difficult to understand, how many things, go, what happens there. Twitter, it's accessible. Instagram, to a certain extent, is accessible as well. I think the problem of extraction of data, it's okay. It can be solved. More interestingly is what you do with the data afterwards, how to process the data, especially if you have quite significant. This is where this AI platforms, have become quite important. RapidMiner is one that I've been playing a little bit with to process lots of data, to extract patterns, to understand, relevance. So we talk about big data when, your Excel software cannot cope with it, right? So this type of data that for Excel, it's you cannot make sense of them with your. So in that case, you need more sophisticated tools. So I mentioned RapidMiner and a few others. Azure, Microsoft Azure, it's the gold standard, of course, for that. They have, all kind of clouds and platforms that you can access depending where you are located. You need to do a little bit of training to understand, how to operate. But Azure is particularly good as well to interpret and to analyze the data from social media.
Thank you. The next question asks, can you see any possibility of digital technologies, including social media, to play a role in facilitating the transformation of transnational identities and common interests over and beyond nation states? From the perspective of public diplomacy, how possible could we utilize digital potentials to get over self-centric, state-centric identities and interests? Wow, that's profound.
No, I understand, but I think it goes back to the basics of public diplomacy. Why do we do public diplomacy in a sense? It's exactly to build this kind of collaborations, to remove some of the perceptions that people have. I think there is one caveat that I would say that I should add about digital. Digital is not in person, and sometimes this kind of digital introduces a second layer that makes this kind of feeling of collaboration, not the connection that you expect to happen, not particularly good. Been studies about this. I'm not saying something new in the sense that in-person collaboration contributes more to creating a more positive environment for the type of things that the participant asked. But on the other hand, you can prepare the ground, no question about it, with the digital. You can introduce, topics. You can reach out to people that you don't expect in the past, didn't expect in the past to be able to reach. You can bring networks. I think that's one contribution that I think is still valid for social media. The what I call the network of networks, being able to connect with different communities. And depending on the type of project, to bring them along and have a collaboration. The question of identities is interesting. I don't have a clear answer for that. Identities are shaped by multiple factors. That's the reason. There is one thing that we saw with social media is that there is sort of bias towards the negative side, in the sense that there's this kind of communities of hate that seems to prosper more than the communities of goodwill. It doesn't mean that we don't have community that actually do good work, but there seems to be some sort of bias towards that, and that creates this kind of reservation about. So we have to think more creatively, how to deal with that. I mentioned the case of micro communities. This is something that I think will go back in terms of being more trusted communities in which you can actually have a conversation about critical ideas and advance the agenda, right, on that topic, as opposed to others. I think the gaming has potential on both sides, partly because it's a younger generation in which the identities are not fully formed. This is the process. This is where the entry point is, for Ministry of Foreign Affairs. If you want to develop the more collective or more positive type of relationship, this is the entry point. But as I said, there seems to be already, nationalistic frameworks already have invaded, some of the games that I mentioned, and some countries are quite well ahead of that. So on identities, we'll have. It's also an interesting element that we can talk about probably more in terms of how our identities are evolving. There is this kind of hybridity that we see is not fully physical, fully digital, but something in between. Our life, probably, quite a significant part of it, happens in the digital environment. And we have to understand a little bit ourselves, how to negotiate this kind of. There's a new identity that we negotiate all the time, right? I mean, why we develop this kind of new presence, both physically and in the digital. There is some research looking into how our identities are changed by the fact that we are with the leg in the digital and the leg in the physical. But I think more to look into this also from a public diplomacy perspective, or to build on this, from a public diplomacy perspective, the hybrid type of identities that are evolving. One note on multiverse from this perspective is that that's another danger. I mentioned at the beginning that we spend about 2 hours now, 2 hours and a half on social media. Going into multiverse could increase that time they spend on. So that's another thing that we have to be aware of, right? Not to become fully absorbed. There is a risk of actually, getting more involved in the digital space and forgetting about the physical space to a certain extent. This is why, some suggest that actually AR, right, augmented reality, might be a better way of negotiating this, or looking at as a new technology for engaging with the digital. But there is a balance to be kept, right, between our presence in the physical and our presence in the digital, and how our identity is shaped by this balance. It's work in progress.
Great, thank you. The next question asks, taking into account that a significant part of research that was produced in the last few years regarding embassies, communication in general, and public diplomacy in particular points to a less than sophisticated use of digital platform and digital diplomacy, that I would totally agree. How do you see this reality in the context of the potential public diplomacy 3.0 you've been presenting, which is connecting to trend, some advanced technology and a sophisticated use of digital world?
I think what I think, public diplomacy 3.0 brings, it's a diversity of tools, right? It's not only this kind of addiction to social media, which has become a little bit problematic for the reason that I mentioned. I'm not saying that MFAs will give up social media. No, I mean, it's still a useful tool, not least because you need to defend your policies and reputation. But I think you have to be more diverse and more opportunistic in terms of, understanding what is working, what is not working. I mean, from some of the research that I've done, it's quite interesting that, some of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that are doing quite well digital diplomacy, and by digital diplomacy, I don't mean only social media, digital diplomacy using, are those in which, the heads of the digital diplomacy units are ambassadors, traditional ambassadors. And I found that puzzling. In some ways, for many others, you see people working previously working journalists being brought, to run these units. And of course, if you bring someone from journalists, then, the emphasis on public diplomacy is strictly on digital diplomacy, strictly on communication. But for those that I mentioned before, ambassadors, they have a bigger picture of the world. This is what are they trained. Senior diplomats have a bigger. They know to connect the dots, right? They see a bit the world in bigger terms, and this is why they see the potential for communication, public diplomacy. But they also look around. What seems to be working. Why is that relevant? How to so they experiment. They invited people from the AI community to give presentation, to teach their diplomats, how AI is working. They invited people from blockchain. They experimented. They tried to see how these ideas may work in that realm. What is the value added? So I think this is what I call the more opportunistic side. But you need a little bit of more a larger background, in a sense. And I found the fact that senior ambassadors are able to steer the boat in that direction, bringing more ideas, to the fore. And senior ambassadors, you have to remember, they have power in the sense they are able to bring resources to the table. And by resources, I don't mean funds. I mean also expertise from different departments. I remember one case. It's for instance Finland, very innovative one that I looked at. Very innovative. It's also very flexible, but also because the way in which it does digital diplomacy relies on uses. It's steered by people with this kind of larger background, trying to understand new trends. Not being afraid to test them, right? I say if I go to Ministry of Foreign Affairs and told them about non-fungible tokens, they'll say, well, what is nonsense? Why are you talking about this? It may be, it may not be. The point is that you want to experiment because it's a big thing happening at the moment. The same thing is happening with games. You shouldn't be afraid to test. It may not work, but the point is that if you test and see the value of it in the type of work, the senior ambassadors can do that. They have a little bit of a shield of immunity against criticism. So I found them, better stewards of digital diplomacy.
Very good. We probably have time for one more question. So this question asks, what countries do you think are leading the way in managing and utilizing these disruptions well? And who has stepped into the space and failed?
I think the first country that comes to mind is Israel, by far. And the reason is exactly what I said. They are experimenting all the time. Every platform I'm trying to get, I find them there. I didn't expect them to find them on Telegram. They were there with lots of subscribers. I found them on Facebook. I found them on Twitter. I found them in the multiverse. Talking about this. It's also the fact that they bring people with expertise to the table. So this is a very agile. Speaking about managing change, agile, creative. Trying to. They've done good work also during COVID. They have set up a system in which that stimulates creativity. For instance, what I learned is that they create a competition between various embassies around the world. Which one is performing better this month and becomes, the digital ambassador or the digital embassy of the month. So there is a push towards stimulating creativity. But the key word is experimentation and openness, right? They test and try almost everything. Some things will work, some things don't. They discard it. But I think I think it's a model adapted for the digital age. I think Alec Ross said that that in the 21st century is not a good thing to be a control freak, and I think it still applies. This Alec Ross, the digital the senior advisor for Hillary Clinton on digital matters. So don't be a control freak, because then you'll go mainstream. You'll do because you say, well, the risk is too much, it's too big. I'm not going to do this. You have to experiment, and this experimentation actually, does well. In the case of Israel during the pandemic, what they've tried also, they started to, because everybody could not travel, they started to share their experience. Started to do training for many other governments interested in digital diplomacy. And that's public diplomacy per se, right? Because you train people to do digital diplomacy in a particular way. That's an element through training, through not by sharing stories, but through training, through performance, that actually they've done quite well. I think there are a few others in addition to Israel. I think the Scandinavians are doing quite well. I'm not mentioning the big ones, because the big ones sometimes, the UK, US, others are doing. They already have a lot of clout, right? So I'm talking about those who are middle-sized countries who actually are able to perform or to punch above their diplomatic weight quite well using these digital tools. I've seen also a little bit in Africa, some of the countries, trying to move. Ethiopia at some point, trying to do a lot with digital. And I think it's again, the creativity element that comes to the fore.
Okay, so maybe we have space for one more question. How can you define digital international relations? Do other trends besides you have mentioned shall be included in a new system of digitalized system of international relations? Wow, that's a great question.
No, absolutely. I'm working, with some colleagues on a book exactly on this digital international relations, not digital diplomacy. Now we try to unpack, the concept of digital international relations, and it's interesting because generally speaking, we talk about relations of power, but where is power nowadays in the digital, right? I mean, and we've seen some important actors. Everybody is afraid of them. Everybody's trying to cultivate relationship with them. For instance, the big tech companies. These are different type of factors. They are not the type of multinationals that we've seen in the 80s. This is a different type of game. For some, they actually have sovereignty of their domain over their domain. I mentioned the case of Facebook. If you want data from Facebook, you have to go and knock at the door, even if you are the U.S. government, right? I mean, if they don't want to give you, they don't give you. With regulation and so on. So I think we see a little bit of the rise of new actors. Diplomatically speaking, that has been already recognized in the sense that some governments appointed special ambassadors to deal with these big tech companies. They are called tech ambassadors. There are about 20 of them around the world. Denmark started first in 2017, and by now there are about quite a strong community, 20 plus tech ambassadors around the world, with a mission to actually negotiate traditionally, right, and negotiate relationship with the big tech companies. But it's more than that. I think it's also decentralization of power. We see nowadays, individuals, not only states, individuals being able to leverage a lot of power if they have the right resources. I'm mentioning the case of mercenaries. Mercenaries are coming back. Digital mercenaries are coming back. These are people with special, unique expertise that they know how to hack, they know how to conduct this information, and they are working on the dark side, right? They are working on as freelancer. Whoever pays them more, they do it. And being cases of privateers and mercenaries doing this kind of work. And I think on the public diplomacy will be interesting also to see, what kind of, like this center and others, accumulating this kind of unique level of expertise and be able to exert a lot of influence. So I think that digital international relations is expanding the spectrum of actors. In addition to government, international organization, you have, you have also the tech companies, but also individuals. I think individuals per se, right, are becoming quite relevant in the context of being able to shape the dynamic or to shape international affairs.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. What a great conversation for both of you. We had so many questions, both submitted at registration and that came through the portal. Corneliu, you handled them like a champ. I am not surprised. But before we close out this, I have a question for you, and it's a simple yes or no. And I'd love to hear Aimé's answer too. Should practicing diplomats today care about this and integrate it into their public diplomacy practice? Yes or no?
Absolutely. I mean,
Yes.
if you don't do it, you're losing the game. I mean, that's the truth.
And Aimee, as a researcher?
Oh, absolutely, yes. If you're not doing it, you're going to be left behind.
All right, that question came through quite a bit in the portal, and I just wanted to end on that note of absolutely. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for the audience. Thank you for Aimee. I put a link into the chat for our next event with fan favorite Philip Sieb on January 25th. And everybody wish David Bowie a happy 75th birthday today. I thank you all. Be well, be safe, be healthy, and we will see you online soon. Take care, and thank you on behalf of the Center on Public Diplomacy.
Thank
Bye,
you all.
everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Stacey. Thank you.
Great
Bye.
evening.